welcome to the second season of Tailwinds, the podcast associated with the Department of the Air Force's Air and Space Operations Review Quarterly Journal. I'm Laura Thurston Goodrow, and today we'll be visiting with Dr. Fil Arenas, author of Organizational Toxicity, Inner Circles of Harmful Leadership, in our winter 2023 issue. Dr. Arenas is currently an adjunct professor for Troy University's doctoral program in global leadership. In 2005, he retired from the military after 28 years of faithful service, 14 serving with the Air Force and 14 serving with the Navy. Originally reporting as a faculty member for the Squadron Officers School in August 2007, Dr. Arenas retired in 2021 as an associate professor of leadership studies at Air University's Leadership Institute and the Air War College, also here at Maxwell Air Force Base. Welcome to the podcast, Phil.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here, Laura. I'm so glad to talk a little bit about the article. Again, enjoy my time with you today.
Oh, great. We're looking forward to it. This is going to be a great opportunity to preview your article for those who haven't read it. So first of all, I always ask people, other than the obvious, time in the military, in your case, what is the root of your interest in the subject of leadership studies?
I've thought about that throughout the years, and probably mine goes back to my interest in leadership has grown from my time growing up with as a military brat. A military brat is, for those of your listeners who don't understand, it's an endearing term for a child of a military member. And my dad was proud to say he was a Navy Chief Petty Officer, raising 3 sons.
That's great.
Of course, we gave our mom and dad a hard time, as 3 boys usually do. But I think he treated us really as junior sailors. And so the types of values that he instilled with us stemmed from not only doing the right thing, but being accountable for our actions and being responsible. And that drove me for really the rest of my life. I hearkened back to a lot of his lessons over the years. And I think it's the kind of mindset that had, pushed me towards organizations like the Boy Scouts. And I even signed up for NJROTC in high school and eventually, 28 years in the active duty in the military. So I think, following that, I think I like the idea of this structured environment with, this is going to sound crazy, but with rules and regs, and
Right.
I mean, a lot of people are going to laugh at that, but I think I like the structure of it. And I think I like, I'm a very goal-oriented person. So probably one of the greatest things in the military is that, the harder you work, the quicker you get promoted. And I kind of like that incentive growing up in the military. I did another 14 years as a DoD civilian at Air University. In fact, I just, 2021, as you mentioned, I just retired from that job. And I only mention that because after 42 years in DoD, it has enabled me to have the best seat in the house, I tell people, for leadership. Lots of civilian organizations have reached out in many organizations at our university where I was associated. For instance, when I was at Squadron Officer College, building leadership courses there, we would have MIT and Fort Walton Beach Police Department and various civilian organizations reach out to us for leadership development ideas. And they would constantly ask us for our curriculum. And I thought, wow, this is quite a compliment, as they always considered, a lot of organizations consider the military as the gold standard for leadership development. So I think I believe that too. I strongly believe in that idea because unlike most organizations, regardless of the service that you're in the military, we all have that underlying goal of developing our followers into leaders. I mean, where else does another organization think like that? I mean, from the time you begin, you're being developed as a future leader for your branch of the service. I mean, we look at all of our followers as future first sergeants and future chief master sergeants or officers, colonels, and generals down the road. So it's kind of a big responsibility, but we add that to the long list that we have in the military of, all of our collateral duties and all of our training and all that. But we always stay true to that primary mission that ongoing duty of developing leaders.
Yeah, that's very true. It's all centered on that. And I'm glad you mentioned that the military kind of serves as a gold standard for leadership. When they look at leadership, that's a lot of civilian institutions and researchers look to the military because that's what we do, right?
Exactly.
So on that, now we switch to broad leadership, and the journal issue that you wrote in was one devoted to the subject of toxic leadership. And I learned a lot in the production of that piece about contemporary scholarship on toxic leaders, on the subject of toxic leadership in general, leadership, but toxic leadership. So for our listeners, can you just give a little background on the toxic leadership component of leadership studies, where we're at in terms of scholarship?
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people think toxic leadership is sort of a new problem, but it really has been around for quite a while. Although Marcia Wicker, who's the one who actually coined the term toxic leadership back in '96, other forms of toxicity were very prevalent, going as far back as the '70s, '60s, and '70s under different names. And one of the things I did in this article was I went back a little bit, and workplace harassment and bullying were two of the most popular ones during that time. And if you look at the definitions of those terms, you'll see that they align perfectly with toxic leadership definitions today. They all involve destructive leadership and, harassing their employees and torturing them in many ways mentally and just abusing them at various levels. So I thought it would be a good idea to just kind of tie those three together in this article as I continued to tie how they affect organizations. Now, my go-to sources, you mentioned scholarship. You can refer to my article on various references and sources that I use. But my go-to sources, if you had to pick up, say, 2 or 3 toxic leadership references for your library to get smart on pretty quick, I would say my number one would be Jean Lippman Blumen's Allure of Toxic Leadership. And that's she wrote that back in 2005. What a saint. She's out at Claremont, and she's going to actually turn 90 this month.
Wow, that's amazing.
And yeah, I believe she's an emeritus professor out there, and she just won another award for lifetime achievement in leadership or something like that. But she's got a lot of YouTube videos out there. She's a very interesting lady, very, very sharp in many leadership areas, but this is just one of them. Her book really digs deep, and it's actually, I developed a toxic leadership elective at ACSC back in around about 7 years ago, about 2017. And this was one of the key references that I used for that course. Another one is George Reed's Tarnished. A lot of people have heard of that, but he's a retired colonel from the Army, and he wrote this back in 2015. But what I love about this book is it ties in toxic leadership in the military environment. And he approaches all services. He talks about all the damage and the destruction that has been created in all of the military services. It's not just an Army book. As I mentioned in the article, the Army is really the first service to actually, in their military doctrine, define toxic leadership.
Yep.
They've made adjustments over the years, but it's funny how the other services have kind of steered away from those terms. And then another one that I like to use is a book by Alan Goldman, 2009. It's actually called Transforming Toxic Leaders. The course that I wrote at ACSC, the elective, is called Transforming Toxic Leadership. So I kind of borrowed that idea to focus on how we can transform, bad behaviors and get them back on track, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But as I point out in the article, you can't save them all. I mean, occasionally you have a leader that's so far on that continuum that they can't be really
rehabilitated.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Sometimes you have to get rid of them, especially if they're destroying morale in organizations.
Yeah. So on the article, now that you've given us some background, first of all, I want to say I love the hook of your article because it makes the reader want to read it, where you say, have you ever complained about a boss to a friend only to discover they have a similar story? Which is a great intro. And while your article discusses these so-called bad bosses, it really focuses on the problem of the harmful inner circles of followers, a toxic leader's willing entourage, as you call them. So please tell us about that, since that's kind of the thrust of the article, the idea of this group of people that actually facilitate toxic leadership's, toxic leaders' behavior.
Yeah, and that's kind of the root of Lippmann Blumen's ideas. She doesn't so much focus on the toxic leader, but she spends a lot of time on the follower. I firmly believe that some of these leaders are too far gone, and it's the followers that are being developed right underneath our noses. And I decided to dig into that area. They're present every day. And I think it's important that we recognize some of those signs and symptoms. They're part of a support system that enables these toxic leaders. So these inner circles that I describe are actually based on if you could hang your hat on a leadership theory, it would be the LMX theory, or the leader member exchange theory. And that, in a nutshell, that describes the dyadic relationship between that follower and the leaders. And in many cases, there are two different areas there of support systems. One of them is the inner circle, or the high member exchange group. And then the other one is the outer circle, or the low member exchange group. Now, the difference is just like it sounds. The high exchange group, this is rewarded by trust and career benefits and empowerment by the leader. So in a nutshell, if this is a toxic leader with an inner group that's enabling their abilities on the toxic side of the house, they pretty much are aiding and abetting this toxic leader. They're growing into toxic leaders themselves. So, and they're protected by the toxic leader. So in many organizations, you've got this going on behind the scenes, and organizationally, they're not going to let their leader fail. They're going to, at all costs, even if they have to sacrifice themselves, they're going to protect that leader, because one day they have found that by mimicking these behaviors, they receive benefits, they receive rewards, they get the good TDYs, and they get the, all the perks. Whereas the out-group members, they're basically just existing. They don't have the same access to the leader. They don't get the trust and empowerment that the inner groups or inner circles get. And eventually their loyalty starts to wane in many cases. Whether there are toxic leaderships behaviors happening, they're the first ones to actually write a complaint against the toxic leader, because they don't have that loyalty. So that's an important relationship to understand. And unfortunately, I would love to say that toxic leadership will go away one day, but I think as long as we have human leaders, and humans are infallible. And a lot of the research says that it's greed and avarice and control that drives these toxic leaders. And George Reed actually makes a great point in his book. He constantly reiterates that the military environment is ripe for toxic leaders. It's very fertile environment because of that, the rank structure, and we have that captured audience, and they have to listen to their superiors' orders, and just have that control. So he gives some examples in his book about the extreme side of that in overseas, and I forget the countries that he was describing, but there was one unit that was deployed, I believe it was Afghanistan, I could be mistaken, but where they were examining a suicide rate in one organization that had skyrocketed. And they, after many years of looking into this, they realized that it was that leader's entourage that was inflicting huge amounts of pain on the followers, that it stressed them out to the point where a lot of them were pushed towards that suicide level. And they actually correlated it with some of those behaviors. So, I mean, what a valuable lesson to learn there, that how, this is a serious topic that can really result in some serious consequences. So we don't need to take it lightly. Now, one of the books that I mentioned, Alan Goldman's Transforming Toxic Leaders, he actually uses a continuum scale that says that the toxic leadership behaviors start at the trace level, could just be, the beginnings of some bad behaviors, but can go to the extreme scale that we just described there with the suicides overseas. So we need to know that it's not black and white. There's a continuum there of destructive behaviors that we need to learn to spot, and this is these flags that we see in our followers, they need to be eradicated at the lowest level so that we don't groom toxic followers into toxic leaders.
Yeah, it's true. I was thinking of the efforts that the Army has undertaken in the last 5 years or more. I can't remember when the program started, but it was a mandatory screening for potential brigade commanders. Do you know
Right.
about that program?
Yes.
So,
yeah.
And I was reading just the other day that there was a 4-star general relieved because of undue influence in command selection in late March. And the writer was talking about hopefully the Army sees that it's necessary to keep this screening, which they don't use entirely, apparently. They use it as part of the normal command selection process. But it's interesting. It's kind of in the news right now. I mean, I think it's always in the news, but.
Yeah, the Army's been working on that screening process for years. I was involved at the outskirts of that, but I wasn't on the team or anything, but I had colleagues that were involved with that heavily. And it's a tough one to implement in the services. But if we can utilize any screening method that might, describe, I don't know, some quirk or some behavior that could, create some damage down the road, it can't be bad, right? We need everything it's a touchy subject, but
it is hard. I mean, I think of the example of, I've been in situations with international travel, especially where you come back through the airport and you deal with maybe a customs and immigration, folks. And it's like with any military law enforcement, you need strong personality types to be firm and to be able to do those jobs. But that line between being firm and strong and then going into being power focused and power hungry is really, really thin. And I saw in one instance a terrible display of this. It was horrible. And so I think those psychological evaluations that say this person may have a tendency in these types of situations to exhibit this kind of behavior.
Yeah. And I guess during interviews in the civilian world, you can kind of pick up on some of that. But in the military, we don't really have anything like that. No filters.
Nope.
But I know exactly what you're saying because I experienced something very similar that we can talk about offline. But you made me chuckle a little bit because you made me relive what I went through a few years ago. The key here is to recognize. I always tell people the first day of class when I'm teaching my toxic leadership course, and actually Dr. Dan Connell took it over for me. So he's kind of continuing that. And I was a guest speaker a couple of weeks ago in his nice. One of his final classes, and it was kind of fun to go back there. And I always open up that class. I used to open it up with, do you know the difference between a toxic leader and a bad leader? And you'd be surprised at how many people can't answer that question, which only illustrates that when you hear someone using the word toxic leadership to describe a boss, you need to pull them aside. I always tell my students, you are now the expert on this definition. You need to pull them aside and say, don't use that term loosely.
Yeah.
That term could get somebody fired. And that's like that's like the kiss of death in a lot of organizations. Those words you don't attach to somebody's reputation. So make sure you know what you're talking about. Now, I always tell them, any of us can have a bad day. The best leaders in the world can yell at their secretary or their airmen, and that doesn't make them a toxic leader. Now, if they did that on a daily basis, they may, there's some data there, that could be some flags for you to watch out for. But as Lippman Blumen describes in a lot of her literature, a toxic leader does enduring harm to not only their followers, but to the organization, or both. And that's what you got to look at. Somebody having a bad day, especially if they're a good transformational leader, they're going to come back the next day and say, I'm so sorry, Margaret. I snapped at you yesterday. I didn't get much sleep. My kid's in the hospital. I apologize. That's a good transformational leader that made a human error. But a toxic leader is more deliberate, and they're smart. These aren't slow people. They're very sharp, very intelligent people I tell people that are my students that they're master manipulators of systems and people. And they'll use that power and control sometimes for evil and bad decisions. So anywho, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, so as we wrap up here, do you have some recommendations for organizations and leaders and followers to help as we talk about mitigating this and dealing with this and hopefully reducing the instance of toxic leaders and toxic followership and all that going forward?
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. A lot of people ask me that. So what? What do we do now? We know they're toxic. Well, and again, you can't transform everybody, but I honestly think you can transfer most of them. And if you can catch the juniors early that are doing these behaviors, you need to pull them aside as a good leader and say, you need to work on that. That could be misconstrued. So knowing the signs, getting educated, create this self-awareness, this culture of self-awareness for yourself as well, so that you recognize that maybe you're falling into some of this darkness, and you don't want to make it a habit. And especially if it's supported by a leader, then that could just lead to even more destruction. So have a lexicon that helps you understand the language, the signs. Forums like this are great. Your article, I thought it was awesome that you dedicated that entire edition of ASOR to toxic leadership within organizations. And then all the authors did a fantastic job of describing different views of that.
They did.
So that's important. Understanding dyadic relationships between leaders and followers. Review that LMX guideline. That will help if you want to hang your hat on a leadership theory. And one of the things, I wrote an article 2 years ago in the Journal of Military Conflict and Transformation. I'm sure you've heard of this.
Yeah.
The Air Force Negotiation Center just stood this up a few years ago. Yep. They asked me to write an article on transformational leadership. And I said, well, I've been dying to get my hands on connecting emotional intelligence as strategies for toxic leadership. So I did an entire article on Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence. He's got this very short model that has 4 components: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, which ties neatly into this LMX idea that we were talking about. So, reading these kind of articles, and I always tell people the easiest way to, if you think you might have some of those tendencies, maybe you have a bad boss that's rubbing off on you a little bit, practice some of these components that Goldman talks about. Do you know your strengths and weaknesses? That's self-awareness. And what do you do about it? Do you know your triggers? What sets you off? We all know that there's that one person or that one situation that sets us all off. That's a trigger. And if you know how to manage that, where you don't fly off the handle, you count to 10 or you do whatever, that's self-management. So that's the personal side. The second side is the social side. So if you can't you fix the social side or build relationships unless you start with the personal side first. You have to understand that and be open with yourself. But then understanding how you interact with other people and how they react to you. Watch, be empathetic and read those signs and read the room. And did I say something to offend you? You need to watch those kind of body language and gestures. You just need to be very aware of how you are coming across. And then, of course, that final component would be relationship management, where you make adjustments. Yeah, there's just a few things there. I think that's enough to start working on it.
Yeah, well, that's what we do. We start and onward and upward, as they say. So I commend your article, Organizational Toxicity, Inner Circles of Harmful Leadership, by Dr. Fil Arenas in our winter 2023 issue of ASOR. And Phil, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been fantastic.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.